Call the meeting to order.
Okay, the meeting has been posted according to open meeting laws.
Roll call.
President Seeger.
Here.
Trustee Ronici. Here. Commissioner Arndt. Here. Commissioner Stitchman. Here. Okay, and that's all we have tonight. Both Commissioner Hayes and Batani are excused.
Do we have to worry about using this tonight? So we're
Yes,
still...
we still have public attending to listen, so it's important that everybody use their microphones.
So citizen participation, anybody in presence that would like to speak during citizen participation?
Steve Lambricks, 2018 Beulah Avenue. Just want to, for item number 10 on the agenda, where you're going to be talking about the Village Comprehensive Plan, item C, where they have the map of the in and around the downtown core, just questioning why it's skewed to the east and to the south, why it's not centered around the square. I would imagine that normally it would be centered around the square, and it looks like we're maybe intentionally excluding the piece of property that started this whole discussion about in and around the downtown core. We've managed to include the East Troy Lake in the core. I don't imagine anybody's going to be building anything there, but we have decided that the in and around the downtown core, for whatever reason, should go much further to the east and the south than to the north and the west. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Anybody else would like to speak during citizen participation? Anybody else who would like to speak during citizen participation? Okay, I'll close citizen participation and move on to approval of the Planning Commission minutes from May 10th.
I'll make a motion, we approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Moving on to amended site plan for LD's Barbecue located at 2511 Main Street for a new building to enclose barbecue smokers, 520 square feet, and a storage shed, 150 square feet. Leon applicant, application 2021-08. Tim?
So just real quick, a clarification. That agenda item refers to a building, and that's not the case. That was an earlier version. So essentially, the proposal is to enclose the smokers with a 7-foot high fence. That's the reference to the building. And then there's a proposal, second part of the proposal to amend the site plan is to construct a 150 square foot storage building. And it's going to be constructed of the materials, basically of the storage shed that's there. Same colors, same materials, and it's going to be placed right next to it. And the fencing around the smokers essentially is going to be vertical boards, with the same kind of coloring as the building. And there's going to be 2 gates, one for access from the restaurant, and the backside is going to be a larger gate for pulling in the wood. Is that correct? Sure, please.
So there'll be 2 gates just to come in, like by the corners of the restaurant, because all the employees come into the back of the building. So if you're looking at the back of the building, there'll be one on the east side toward the road ranger, just like a normal 4-foot door, and then one on the west side toward whatever's over there, I don't remember. The
Auto
parts store, yeah. But on the back end, there'd just be 2 4-foot gates so we can put wood in behind the fence. And I'm not going to construct a building, I'm just going to buy it. I haven't got time for that.
I'm assuming the fence is to prevent vandalism to the smokers? Part of it?
part of it, and to keep people from walking through there. And when the fellow said I tore off a chunk of meat from the smoker and decided it was okay to buy it, I thought, it's time.
And just by way of context, at the next month's meeting, the Plan Commission is gonna be looking at a conditional use for some other changes, on site, along with some additional landscaping, stage area for concerts and things like that. So this is kind of the most immediate need for the petitioner.
And I'm assuming that there's no issues with additional buildings or anything, this is all within, up to snuff?
Yep. It'd be nice to consolidate, but cost is a factor.
Two sitting next to each other is similar enough to one?
No, they actually do get, one accessory building, and that's based on the size of the property, and then they get an additional one as long as it's 150 square feet or less.
So the next time, Leon, you have to add on to one of them. I'll make a motion to approve the amendment of the site plan as proposed and all aspects prior approvals remaining unchanged.
I'll second. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Moving on to discussion related to potential amendments of the zoning code related to building demolitions in the downtown design district. Tim?
So at the last month's meeting, we looked at an early draft of the ordinance and got some feedback. And, basically the takeaway that I heard at that time was, you were looking for a little bit more specifics in terms of the landscaping and then kind of tightening up some of the timeframes. And then, as part of the proposal, and again, this is a draft that's attached to the current, the staff report, I added a subsection D talking about the landscaping plan. And what I did was to kind of parse it out into potential 3 phases. So the first phase is just gonna be simply, turf grass, and getting that, revegetated. And then if the property is still undeveloped after a period of time, then they have to do phase 2 landscaping, which is gonna involve more shrubs, more permanent plantings. And then if it, remains basically undeveloped for a longer period of time, then they're looking at more shrubs, more plantings, and potentially shade trees, decorative trees. And there is a built-in time frame for when that phase 1 landscaping goes into effect. And there is no time frame for phase 2 or phase 3. And that would be, determined or approved or specified at the time the landscape plan is approved. So depending on, the nature of the property, its location, the size of it, its visibility, you might have different time frames for different properties. Again, some guidance, but still creating some more flexibility depending on the circumstance. The other thing that the current draft does, it basically just refers to the section of the municipal code that talks about raising, and that's in section 210-10. And those provisions are on the first page of the staff report. So rather than kind of duplicate those or contradict or confuse the situation, simply what we're doing is referencing that section under what has to be done as part of the raising in subsection C. So it all falls back to the building inspector to issue the permit and make sure the timelines that are specified there are complied with. And actually, it's a very short period of time for compliance in terms of demoing and returning the site back to some sort of flat condition. Foundation has to be taken out. So with that, that was just kind of a real quick overview of the changes what I was trying to attempt. And again, all this was based in part on the comments that we received at the last month's meeting.
I have a couple comments, Tim, only because I was reading through this and I started thinking, I remember, in Waterford, there were two taverns right on the corner of Highway 20 and 83, where you make the right turn to go out towards I-94. One was torn down, the other one had a fire, and they tore that down. But I do remember that there was no dilly-dallying. The last tavern that burnt down, I think it was cleaned up, it was down and cleaned up within a month. But my point is that I do know that in some instances, that demolition would be held up due to investigations, either by the fire marshal or whomever. But what I'm looking at here is 6 months from the date thereof, or completed within 30 days of the date of commencement. So theoretically, they would have 7 months to do the work, because if they waited for 6 months and started, they'd still have another month to get it done. I don't know if I'm all for that, having something, especially like, I'm thinking more of a fire than I am just something that's gotta come down for other reasons. I don't know, I'm thinking 6 months is an awful long time.
So, Section 210-10. So that basically gives, and Scott can jump in here, basically, once you issue the raising permit and they start the work, they've got 30 days to complete it, and it's gotta be flat.
Right, I understand that.
Okay, and basically, if, for whatever reason, they don't start the redevelopment project within that 6 months period, then that's when they have to do that phase 1 landscaping.
Well, and I'm sorry, I might have misread this, but raising permits shall lapse and be void unless work authorized thereby is commenced within 6 months from the date thereof. So they're talking about the raising of the building, not the new construction. And that's what my concern was.
I almost feel like you got a contradiction in what you stated. You're talking about
Right,
the
I understand,
application, and
but
then you're talking about the process.
well,
So
I'm reading right here.
giving them the due diligence of the 6 months, which is already in our building codes that requires, and exactly that, the 210-10. We're talking about, the downtown area, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, on this stuff, but.
So basically, if somebody walks in and gets a raising permit for a building, regardless of where it's located, they have 6 months to use it.
I understand.
If they don't use it, it's void.
Okay, but that also goes in case there was a fire and the building is demolished and it's sitting there. They can dilly-dally for 6 months before they have to have it down?
No, I think you would simply follow your other property maintenance requirements in terms of derelict buildings.
Okay, again, I just wanted to make sure we weren't gonna tie our hands down the road.
I think what you're missing here, Forty, is that that's the current code. This isn't something we're working on new. I mean, so this is just here more or less for a reference due to the fact that it's included in what we're working on new.
So yes, I mean, you could have somebody, with a derelict building and, village orders it to be taken down, right? And there's other sections of the code that talks about you've got X number of days to, either fix or tear down.
And we've done that recently.
Yep.
With a garage.
And then if somebody walks in voluntarily and says, I want to tear it down, then they get the raising permit, and again, it's only good for 6 months. If they don't use it, they have to reapply, pay fees, and then once they start, then they have to complete within 30 days.
Right, I understand.
Okay.
And the other question I had was on the second paragraph. Hold on a minute. can't read this. We're talking about when the debris is hauled away, and you're talking about, if any raising or removal operation under, I guess this is already established, but I'm concerned about the wording here.
We really have to keep our attention on what the new draft ordinance is.
I understand.
We're not talking about, just hear me out.
I understand what you're saying.
We're not talking about the codes here, and that's established. Let's talk about the ordinance. The code that's indicated here in the raising of the buildings simply is a reference point for where you can find this other material about our downtown core, that what we've changed here in our
Well, I just thought if I saw
ordinance.
something that was questionable or I thought was wrong, I should mention it instead of ignoring it, that's all.
I'm not ignoring it,
Is
Gordy, but
is
I'm
there a
continuing with our
timeline?
agenda.
Okay, then on section 1B, and I guess this is the new part that we're talking about, demolition of without a plan for future development? This is the one with the changes in it, correct? On page 2? Should there be a timeline for the landscape? Section 1, letter B.
So I, worked on this and I reworked it, just trying to figure out a good way of kind of organizing it. So basically, subsection A and B talk about the different circumstances where somebody would apply to tear down a building within the downtown area. And there is no, timelines, but those timelines are in subsection D. Okay, so the first part of subsection D talks about, again, a landscape plan, for the property, phasing, what's in phase 1, what's in phase 2, what's in phase 3. And then I'm on page 3 of the ordinance. And then the part about the timing, that's in the first full sentence, where it starts, if a demolition is approved under subsection A, and that's again where somebody thinks they have a development plan, they've submitted the plans, the architectural renderings, they got their site plan. So that's subsection A. Phase 1, landscaping must be completed within 12 months of the start of the demolition if the authorized redevelopment does not commence. So they've got a full year if in fact something falls apart. And if you want to tighten up a timeline, that might be it. And if you keep on going, then it says if a demolition is approved under subsection B, that's where they don't have anything. That's 3 months from the start of demolition. So we've got basically a month for demolition and then 2 months for planting. And then, if you kind of think about when, if somebody starts in November, what happens to that, planting schedule, and that's why it gets a little complicated.
Any other questions?
So I don't have a draft motion, but basically a motion to direct the staff to schedule a public hearing for the draft ordinance as drafted.
Make a motion to direct staff to schedule a public hearing. Anything else? There's something else in there you said.
Based on the current draft,
Based on the current draft.
yes. So that basically just starts the ball rolling.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, moving on to, discussion related to potential amendment of the zoning code related to adaptive uses of institutional buildings in residential areas. Tim?
So this is on the agenda for your consideration, and just by way of background, under your current zoning code, churches and schools and other kinds of institutional uses are allowed as a conditional use within some of your residential districts. Okay? And what we find, increasingly more common is, some of those churches and schools, they go out of business, or they consolidate, or they, buy something different. And then the question is, well, what do we do with that building? Again, a church or a school or, nursing home or, city administrative buildings or something like that. And what we've done elsewhere is to include language within a zoning code that kind of creates a new process that allows an existing institutional use to be converted to something else. And that something else could be commercial, it could be multifamily, it could be a mixed use, it could be something different than that original church, school, whatever. And what we've done is to put together a process, and essentially it's tied to a planned unit development process, which means that developer comes forward with a proposal. His proposal is, this is what I have, this is the church, this is the school, this is whatever, and my idea is to change that into something different. And at that point in time, then the village can determine if that something else makes sense, based on the surrounding properties, based on densities, based on what's being proposed. And then if it does make sense, then you create a planned development district which specifies what uses can occur on that particular piece of property. And essentially what you're doing is you're creating a brand new zoning district just for that parcel. And again, you've got total legislative control over, deciding if that proposal is appropriate or not, or you can impose conditions, you can, basically, work to make sure that whatever is redeveloped is going to fit the circumstance.
So, knowing that there's a particular case of this happening currently, what can be done with the property otherwise realistically, currently with our code?
Well, you'd have to find a different church to buy it.
Someone wouldn't be able to just use it as residence, let's say? 'Cause
Well,
it's
sure,
residential.
sure.
Yeah,
If
that could happen, okay.
Yes, somebody could buy it, turn it into a single-family house, or some other use that is otherwise permitted within that zoning district.
I think that's what happened with the old East Tri Bible Church, right behind the old firehouse. They moved to their new place out on Sterling Circle, and the daycare took over the building. There was a daycare, and, because the village was actually looking at that one time, they're gonna move the hall there. But would that work then now, still?
Well, sure, as long as you can find a similar kind of institutional use to occupy the building, or some other use that's otherwise permitted.
Within that zoning?
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay.
And, obviously, there might be some situations where that might work, but there's other situations where, the building's too big, or, whatever, that just says, nobody's gonna buy it for a single-family house because you could fit 20 inside of it, or something like that.
So this is something that gives the opportunity for, subdivision and, I'm assuming otherwise as well, breaking the lot apart and, removing parsonages and stuff as single family while then wanting to use an additional use for other pieces of the property. This is what we're gonna need to have in order to make some of that work, right? Yes.
This was actually contemplated long before, the instance that we're talking about now. But, it certainly might be a way of approaching that situation. I've not talked to anybody in particular about, potential, adaptive reuse of the property, except for one individual, have not heard since, but there might be some other discussions that you're aware of, but here again, this is just creates the process. And then you would just review them on a case-by-case basis, and depending on their proposal, if it makes sense, you've got the mechanism to, allow it. And if it doesn't make sense, it just doesn't fit, then you can say no.
And none of this weakens us, like, permitted use, that kind of stuff, it's completely planned unit, we can say yes, we can say no, right?
It won't look like we're being arbitrary.
No, because basically what you're doing is you're allowing or creating a process to, consider a use that's not otherwise allowed, right? They can certainly, use it for what other use is otherwise permitted, but this just creates more opportunities for, perhaps finding that higher and best use.
I have one question, as far as this on, under ownership, the third line down on the front page, Division 3. At time of establishment, all land within an adaptive reuse project must be under single ownership or control. Now, my question is, would that include partnerships or consortium or anything like that does the owner?
Short answer is yes.
That's fine, that's
Yep.
fine.
And it could be the case, and I'm not sure this is, true here, but I mean, you could have a nursing home on one property next to a church, and, one developer comes in and he wants to do a planned unit development for both properties. So in that case, then ownership would have to be held by the one developer of both parcels.
So they could co-op, obviously, and, no?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
They just can't, you can't break it up and say, I want this and he's gonna do that. They has to all come together as one single
Right.
collected unit, okay.
Yep. And, kind of the reverse is true as well. Basically, you can't include something as part of your development project that's not truly an institutional use. So you just can't make your property bigger by, buying some additional property around and trying to, game the system that way.
Don't buy the surrounding properties and then act like, and then say, I'm gonna join them and now I'm gonna
Right.
run this game, okay. It's good thinking.
So we're looking for an approval from this body for that process.
So again, I'm not sure if there's a motion, but just like the previous, agenda item, a motion to, if you're satisfied with the draft, make a motion to direct staff to set a public hearing date for the proposed draft.
I would make a motion to set a public hearing for the proposed draft.
I'll second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, moving on, discussion related to potential revisions to the village's comprehensive plan. Tim?
So again, this is kind of a follow-up from our last meeting, or was it the special meeting? I'm not sure, but last time we had talked about, the whole, issue about the comp plan, in terms of the future land use map and how that interplays with the provision in the code, in the goals, objectives, and policies with regard to additional, zoning for multifamily. So, kind of walk through this. Some different ideas are laid out. On the first page is the future land use map. So just by way of context again, you've got the downtown core, and this is typically when you walk around the downtown square, these are the buildings that you see fronting on the square. And then the lighter purple is the area that we identified as the downtown transition, which is typically, single family, might be some duplexes in there, with the idea that those could, over time, turn into more of a commercial business business opportunity, thereby expanding the critical mass of the downtown area. And then, you've got the different, commercial, you've got the single family, and then we've got the planned neighborhood, which is not depicted here. And the brown that you see on this page is that mixed residential. Okay, and then flipping the page 2, there's the definition of what that mixed residential land use category really means. So this is one way of, maybe in part, addressing the situation, basically amending that definition. Because right now, it's basically, set at least or potentially exceeding 6 units per acre. And the proposal is to say that it's allowed 5 units per acre, but not more than 10. Or that could be modified to say no more than 6 units per acre, or some other, language like that. Again, the situation is where most of these mixed residential properties are identified, are in established neighborhoods.
What's funny is that, well, we talk about changing the definition of multifamily and excluding certain things like townhomes, and we really only have one multifamily zoning otherwise. If we start to exclude things, because the next closest thing is attached residential, which we also are talking about considering separately in terms of quantity and percentages. Now, in reading and I don't want to get ahead if we're going to be dealing with some of this stuff, but in reading the attached residential, it actually allows for, realistically, that gap, because it allows for fourplexes. You can't have more than 4, but it's 9 per acre. So really, we start to talk density versus building styles within those densities. Once you really want to get an 8-family building, you are MR10 already. Are you following me here? In order to have 8 units in a single building, you have to have an MR10 zoning. Now, I don't know if we're going to start to get to where we want to rethink some of those things along the way, and stop me if I'm getting too far ahead of us all. But as I think about this paragraph in general, 5 units per acre versus 6, I don't think is really anything that, it's fine to have it there, except for I don't know that that's, apples versus pears. It doesn't seem like we're gaining a whole lot of difference there. And when I think about the 10 units per acre, I kind of didn't like it until the reality is that it has to come as a planned unit development anyway. So the only reason I would suggest pushing it down to 9 is so that we're trying to tell people that we're trying to dissuade the density, but there are times when I think 10 units per acre could be acceptable if it's done in smaller buildings that aren't as many as 10 per building or whatever, which of course would be a lot for an acre. One big building with 10 units on an acre, it's going to look kind of silly anyhow. But I don't know. That's just kind of, that's what I was, perplexed by as I went through it. I feel like AR9, which a lot of the times creates good development, is almost something that could be permitted without having to be a planned unit development, I guess, so that people shopping have an idea of what they could put in right away, as opposed to having to feel like they needed to come with a planned unit development before us ahead of time, AR9 forces that creation of a broken down neighborhood. I don't know if anybody else agrees, but that's the way I see it.
So, perhaps along those lines, because right now, this narrative allows MR10, right? That's the basic premise here. And, sometimes, a narrative like this is also coupled with, this is the description of the future land use, and it equates to the following zoning districts. And in that way, you can say, the only, property or the only zoning classification that if you're mixed residential, you can rezone to A, B, or C, or A or B, or whatever you say as part of that description. So instead of leaving it open, say that if you rezone, these are your options. And we can just take off MR10 as part of this description.
Yes, to that, in essence, because I think that's, you still have mixed residential, and I get that, because otherwise, really, you're not eliminating anything. And if I'm understanding, you were basically saying that this description doesn't, it includes all the housing, and it's mixed housing, so it includes all the housing zoning districts. It doesn't exclude a single one, they're all possible. It's just that anything above a certain amount is required to be a planned unit development, which theoretically actually is some of the single-family development zonings. I guess if I'm being generous to the idea, I would almost say something, unless we intend to make more zoning districts that are lower, like an MR8 or something like that, that really, you only would really have to worry about the MR10 being the planned unit development. I would think that an attached residential 9 is something that we could allow a developer to shop the property and believe that they are going to get in without any hoops to jump through additionally. Because the nature of it is already more similar to a single-family neighborhood than an MR10 is.
So yes, I mean, technically, somebody could walk in with a mixed residential property on the future land use map and say, I want to go to TR8. That's what I want to rezone to, right?
Except for in this, it would have to be a PUD still.
No.
It wouldn't?
Under the current,
Oh, under the current.
yes. Somebody could walk in and say, I want to rezone to TR8, right? Because it's single family, so on and so forth, and that would be probably deemed appropriate. The only issue came up when, in this instance, it was said, I want MR10. And that just kind of, raised a lot of eyebrows, and neighbors got kind of upset and so on and so forth.
So what I get to with this again is that I think if we're going to have it where planned unit development is required for multifamily in general, and unless we are intending, this is kind of like some of this is cart before the horse stuff, I guess, is what I'm a little bit worried about. If we're intending on removing attached residential 9 from multifamily designation, then this can work. But I think the easiest answer is simply to say that if it's a density above 9, that's when it has to be a planned unit development. That way, regardless of what we choose to do with the designation of some of the other multifamily verbiage, we have the MR10 planned unit development thing handled without having to worry about dissuading someone who is going to use a more constructive density, lower density, a shorter density, I don't know what you want to call it, but something that is a little bit more in line with single-family homes that surround some of these areas. Maybe it's a better image in my head that I'm speaking it, but
I hope so, because I'm not following very well.
Okay, I think that I want people to be able to believe that if they wanted to come in and put in a low, I'm going to use the word condo. I know that we all say that we've had our discussion about that. It's who owns it, whether it's rented, whatever. But because everybody has an idea of what they think a condo looks like, something like Edward Street, if somebody were to come in with a plan like that, I would want them to believe that they can simply get that done, and even though we've been calling it multifamily. As opposed to them going, I have to get a plan approved through a PUD, through a planned unit development before I really want to decide whether or not I want to write an offer on this property. I would like them to believe that their idea is going to work unless it really is this biggest hoop to jump through.
And your idea of that is AR9.
Well, my idea of that is that, yes, that for one, I would prefer that this was geared towards encouraging something less than MR10. And so, and I think the best way to do that is to make it so that that hoop of jumping through a planned unit development phase is started at 10 rather than at a multifamily that might be, you know, less than that. Now, like I said, there's other ways to solve that by making it so that we don't designate certain things multifamily, which I know is some of it, but the easiest answer on this particular paragraph would be simply to require PUD at 10 rather than anything less.
So, yeah, you know, that certainly can be done. Again, as revised, the maximum would be 10 units per acre. And again, that's based on the proximity of all the residential areas. I mean, this is, you know, these are basically infill properties. They've got single family around them, so on and so forth. And maybe, you know, it's not appropriate to go more than 10 per acre. Maybe we just say, you know, the equivalent zoning classification for this mixed residential future land use category is AR9, period. Again, you know, just looking at the map, you know, these are kind of in established areas.
And again, like I said, that would be something that I guess maybe that's what's being missed. That sounds like a perfect answer. But I also know that there are times when somebody, if they wanted to squeeze that extra unit on the acre, could come with a plan that works just as well, if it was done, you know, right. But, you know, but then they're probably also gonna look at that extra unit and say, but I also now have to do the process of submitting a plan, whereas they can otherwise just know that they could do it.
So just kind of, you know, building on that idea, then basically saying you can have AR9, you know, by right as part of the rezoning, and you can go MR10, but anything that is developed at that density up to a certain amount is going to be a PUD process. And maybe it's you know, 10 to, you know, 13 units per acre. Again, you know, just, you know, kind of looking at the map and proximity, you know, anything more than 13, you know, might just be pushing the envelope too much.
So in changing this to the AR9, does this assist in any of the complications in the areas we've had these discussions because of? Steve, if we put this into an AR9 on your property, would that be something that would entice a purchase on that property and allow for what we're looking at? Okay. It does. And I think that's exactly what Penny has been saying tonight.
I like the AR9 zoning. It's a well-written zoning. It's got a lot of stuff to create harmonious development for neighborhoods. I mean, that's my honest opinion of it. It's well-written. And it actually, it's a huge gap filler. I mean, when we talked about not having enough multifamily zoning, AR9 is a big bridge.
So having said all that, you know, maybe we just say, you know, the equivalent zoning for the mixed residential future land use category is AR9, and just leave it at that, unless you want to go to a higher density.
No, I don't, but, and yes, because AR9 allows everything else basically below it, so it's in good shape.
Are you okay with that, Tim?
Yeah.
I
But
mean,
no, I mean, it's what we're here for, to talk about and clarify and,
Does it make sense?
yeah.
well, and arguably, you know, so somebody's gonna question why label it mixed residential? Well, it designates that you want to push a density up, you know, that's one of the things that's there. I mean, and if somebody wanted to come in and do some, I mean, actually, I couldn't understand the back house one, or why anybody would put an alley in when you have to have streets anyway, but, you know, you have these also density of the traditional front homes that, and if you're trying to encourage a little bit more density in here, that's an okay paragraph to still have within the comp plan, but, you know that AR9 is what gives you a huge amount of flexibility to do that density.
Okay, so we can rework that language. The other idea, and again, you know, just an idea that maybe, isn't needed now, is to simply, you know, identify on the future land use map, you know, particular properties that you would consider to be infill development. Again, you know, typically the mixed residential, but then allow somebody to come in, again, with a specific development plan to say, I want to create a PUD on this property because it's shown as infill development on the future land use map. Here's my proposal, here's my idea. Go through the process. If it makes sense, then you can approve it.
And this would be done in accordance with our 2030 plan?
Right, so basically on the future land use map, you would have little stars or circles or, you know, something denoting specific properties that you've identified as being infill development. Again, typically in established areas, and then with that designation, then they can come in again with a specific proposal.
Could you enlighten me a little bit about infill development? I mean, are you talking about just like development of a property that might have been the redheaded stepchild out there, just left alone and nothing was ever done with it? Everything else is built up around it?
But you're suggesting that we would identify these particular properties and say, this is definitely one that needs to have this flexibility as infill.
Yes.
I think that's something that we'd want to have staff help with that process, because maybe commissioners aren't completely privy to where all of our owned or trapped land properties are.
That's a good idea. You know, we got in a problem with that, remember when they were doing Edward Street and that cul-de-sac back there?
So, you know, so we can certainly rework A, and then maybe, you know, doing so, you know, we wouldn't need to do option B.
Well, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Tim, but if, due to the mixed residential on some of this stuff, and then, quote, infill development opportunities, that infill development could also allow, though, for commercial development to be decided to be on that property or something like that, though, too, right? I mean, if it's gonna be a PUD, somebody could come and say, you know what actually works really well for infill here is the front half of this property being commercial and the back half being residential, rather than it sticking with this mixed residential call. You know.
It depends where the lot is though, Benny. Really.
Well,
I mean, I give you an example.
A lot can have two different zonings on it.
Well, yeah, but I'm giving an example. Down on Thomas, I'm working on a job, and right around the first corner there's an empty lot on the left-hand side. But that's gotta be residential. I don't think they'd want, yeah.
But we have that opportunity as a PUD to make that decision, or at least prevent a decision that we're not happy about.
So, as envisioned, basically, if the property is shown as mixed residential, and there's a little star on the property, or otherwise designated as infill development, then basically they would still have to do residential. They can't say, well, I wanna do industrial, PUD on it, or, commercial. It's basically has to be kind of within the bounds of what the underlying area is.
Okay, so we wouldn't go through the map and relabel some of these things saying, well, actually, this would work as an infill development instead, and therefore it has that additional opportunity to possibly have commercial designation or something like that.
Well, obviously this can get real, complicated. But, basically you could have a classification for commercial infill development. Mixed use, PUD and residential PUD. So you could have the three infill types shown on the map. But I don't think you would want to leave it undefined so that somebody walks in with something that's kind of off the wall. Just my thought.
Again, as Scott stated, staff knows some of these things better than some of us others. I just thought, there could be some road-facing properties here that, possibly, would benefit from a commercial opportunity, but.
And I think that's what we did in part with the downtown transition area. So we'll kind of put that in the back pocket a little bit, and keep on going. Obviously, can come back to it and kind of, figure out exactly what you want to do. So option C is to, kind of narrow the definition of that policy with regard to, additional multifamily. So there's various elements of here, as part of this, revision. The first is, most notably, is defining the extent of the downtown area. So basically, if you've got a property within that area, and if you want to rezone it, then that would be permissible, even though the overall proportion of multifamily would exceed that 30%. And here again, this line that I drew is basically, just a starting point for discussion. It can, be oddly shaped. It doesn't have to be a square. It could be a circle. It could be any kind of irregular, boundary. Again, this was just an idea to kind of put something on a piece of paper to say, this is one way of defining the extent of the in and around downtown area. So you can do that. And the other part is to define exactly what we're talking about with regard to multifamily. It does not include duplexes, townhomes, or special housing facilities such as nursing homes and senior housing. And the other part is to simply only apply, that threshold, that percentage threshold, when you have a development project that exceeds 5 dwelling units per acre. Then it would kick in. So here again, you can kind of mix and match some of these, or we can look at alternative language.
Well, again, 5 units per acre is hardly multifamily. So that could probably be a little bigger number, like, I don't know, at least 6. But I was thinking maybe even 8. But especially because that keeps you down into the zonings that don't have, big multifamily looking type buildings. The other thing is, like, the in and around the downtown core, I just feel like that should just say in the downtown core or downtown transition, period. I mean, this is not downtown, but this is a circle of, this is a lot of neighborhood. This is all of South Street. And I know that you said it was just a starting point, but I think it's awfully big. I think that and I said this at other meetings, I think that the blight issue is already a very useful tool to handle the tough spots within the village. And when it comes to not including, duplexes, townhomes, or special housing facilities and so on, The only one I would risk is when you consider senior housing, because that's really just a definition of the resident and not as much of the building, and that's clearly a big multifamily building sometimes. I would encourage that a definition is found to disclude 4-unit buildings that are similar to Edward Street in AR9, because, and I don't know what should be the defining characteristic of that, if it should be, overall roof height or number of shared common walls, or something like that could possibly define what gives you that better street front look than, a salt box with, 4 units in it, or 8, or 10. And then I could see those things, I guess, to make things simple so people could drive down the street, I can see the Edwards Street area not counting as multifamily. It looks like a good traditional neighborhood street front, even though it's, an attached residence.
So those are basically built as townhomes? They're attached side by sides, right? Yeah, there's more than 2. Right. So townhomes, under the current definition, would not be considered multifamily?
But is there a definition of townhome?
Yes.
There is.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know what it is offhand?
So by definition, a townhome is a single-family house that's on a single lot, and it's attached on one or both sides to another townhome. That's a classic definition of a townhome. You actually own the lot. And that's different than owning it as part of a condominium, where you have one lot with all the individual units.
So is that the way that it is over on Edward Street, or is that a condominium project? Okay.
It's a condominium. Yeah, there's 1 or 2 buildings, but down at the end of Brooks Court, and those are duplexes. I think those are duplexes, but the rest of Edward Street is condos.
So to address that situation, then again, townhome, again, is a very technical, ownership type. Basically, what we can do is substitute that term for attached housing, and that way, the attached homes can be either a town home on a single-family lot next to other lots that are also attached. Sorry. But then that would allow also for a condo owner situation, where you still have attached homes, but they're on a larger single lot as a condominium.
Yeah, I think that's what we should do.
Yep.
And then, is there somewhere we can put that definition in our code?
Yes, I mean, it would be part of the, that last paragraph. For the purpose of this policy, multifamily does not include duplexes, attached housing.
I mean, I know that some of this seems like it's common sense, but, should we have a set of definitions for these housing types?
Yes. Yep.
Does anybody else want to speak to the downtown, definition, or nobody really voiced up on that one?
My recollection of the downtown core discussion, and I think, going back to our prior conversation, one of the things I was gonna say about the infill is sometimes staff doesn't even know these issues exist till we start getting the phone calls. Start getting the phone calls because somebody's listing the property and we realize that it's an issue, and it's the same thing with the institutional discussion we had, you know, now all of a sudden my phone's ringing because somebody's interested in selling a property, and I'm getting numerous calls, you know, within 2 weeks on the same property. So in or around the downtown core, I felt like part of that language was prompted by the Chester Burns property. I felt like when we talked about it, that was one I was receiving calls about, and it wasn't for any particular interested party. It was that I knew it was gonna be a sticking point with redevelopment of the property based on the calls I was getting. So, you know, looking at the orientation of the property, I don't know, I'm not a developer, I don't know if, you know, townhomes would, make sense, you know, if they'd be able to cash flow that type of development, that would be a developer question. But I just, you know, I feel strongly that that was one of the properties we had talked about when that language came up, and, you know, obviously, after the fact, it's easier to, you know, easy to look at it and say the language wasn't clear enough, and we all can question what it exactly meant, but I did feel like that was included in that discussion.
Well, I feel like because of how, or at least with some of the decisions and ideas that we have tonight, with condominiums and all these abilities for a developer to reduce, you know, roads and some of the heavier expenses that come from traditional development, I feel like there's an opportunity for some of these properties now to be used by developers to get their money back out of them while not necessarily disrupting, you know, the neighborhood and its, you know, the way it's been handled for the last several decades. I get why, you know, the village has its ordinances and stuff about its road sizes and sidewalks and all those things, and, you know, you can avoid some of that stuff with some of the other development opportunities we've created in the last few months, which is nice, for these infill properties. I still think that the downtown core thing, but I think we should define it as simply the downtown core and the downtown transition in terms of rezoning multifamily is handy, because that way if somebody were to want to grab up, this is where you'd need to do it. If you were to grab up a handful of lots with, you know, breaking down homes and some of the homes that are in poor shape, now you have an opportunity to do that demolition and do some of that stuff. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to necessarily scrap it. It may have a value, but I really do think it should just be the two purples.
Can I ask a question? I'm just curious, I'm looking at the map and the in and around the downtown area. Now, the only thing that we really have, we haven't included that area by Lobbers, have we? That down where McPherson Concrete's got their stuff down in the hollow there, and then right next to the railroad tracks. That used to be where Equity would get their stuff delivered by rail down in there.
No, that would not be part.
Okay,
It's not part of the, two colors of.
okay. Well, again, I was just curious. The other question I had was about the where the Baker Labs was, there next to the lumberyard there, off between, Center and on Bulin Center, I'm sorry. Yes. That property then is not included also, correct?
Correct.
So again, I'm, you know, just kind of maybe parroting back what I'm hearing, but, you know, one idea is to modify, again, that first policy, and basically excluding multifamily with the exclusions down below, when a rezoning is for more than, we can say, 8 dwelling units per acre. or some number bigger than 5. I'm just putting out a number.
Okay, well, yeah, I was otherwise gonna say 9, because then well, okay, we've already disclosed, yeah, you're right, 8, go with 8. I guess to some degree, then we're not allowing anything. That's multifamily unless we create a new zoning, because just about everything below, like I said, if we,
So if somebody wants to do a PUD multifamily, then they can propose whatever density. And that's basically what happened with, help me out here, the lofts. They're at 20 units per acre, roughly.
okay, then, yes, then I would say 8's a good number.
Okay. And then what we can simply do is to say, you know, that in or around, we're gonna substitute for the downtown core or the transition area as depicted on the future land use map. And then we're gonna get rid of that blue dotted line. And then what we can do too is to identify, you know, certain of the larger, properties that are currently shown as mixed residential as infill development. So we would have a little star on those properties, okay? And then basically with that, then they can do the PUD as infill development.
One of those starred areas would, for an example, would be the Chester Burns property.
Yes. And whatever other properties you wanna do.
I don't mean to be throwing it at you guys for administration, but are you okay with helping us with identifying some of those properties that may want to have the star? You know of certain scenarios that maybe we're not privy to. I know that one on Division Street is a challenging property that might wanna have a star. The one that's narrow and long and has a, grade change.
North of North Avenue? Next, over by
Yes.
Wildwood?
Yes.
There's that one, on Division.
Just benefit, is that a single-family lot or multifamily, or mixed residential?
It's a large lot, it's a large wooded lot. That's,
It's next to multifamily, is it not?
yeah, sandwiched between.
So is that property currently shown as mixed residential on the future land use map? Okay.
To open a bingo casino on it or something.
A bowling alley.
I'm just being
Straight.
facetious, there you go.
So yes, as part of this whole amendment process, you know, we can make other revisions to the future land use map. Not only what we're talking about here, you know, 40, you pointed out some duplex parcels that are currently shown as single family, and we'll have to, you know, just look at that.
I think that would make for a nice weekend to walk around someday and just kinda go up and down some of the side streets and take a look at them.
So that's one of the properties, that maybe would have a star on it. Chester Burns property is another one, and like I said, I'd really wanna have staff help us with kind of figuring these things out, because there's just properties we can't account for, because we don't know the situations.
And I'm sure Scott probably has a handful of properties in mind, maybe? Okay.
He'd be what I consider staff. So we're not gonna do much more with that then, Tim, until we get maybe some of those starred properties. We figured out the other ones that we've identified as being the AR9. We've also identified that we're not going to necessarily have in or around the downtown core and the blue dotted lines, but maybe just identifying with the purple shades that we have right now to really identify our downtown.
Correct. And, I'm not sure of the timing of everything. Obviously, it's gonna take more time to think about that infill development, approach. And maybe that's kind of a follow-on to the first phase of amending the code or amending the plan. Because with some of these other, clarifications or, changes, I think it's going to serve your short-term needs to get things moving along. But then coming back and talking about infill development as kind of a long-term strategy.
Can I just clarify that I'm understanding this approach correctly? So the infill development, we would, that would be the mixed uses that we have on the map that we identify. And those could exceed the dwelling unit per acre, the 8 dwelling units per acre that we discussed through a PUD if the commission finds the proposal reasonable.
Correct.
Okay.
And if they just want to stick with the AR9, they can do that.
Any other questions, comments? You have enough for now?
So potentially for the next month's meeting, there might be a draft resolution for your consideration.
So any recommendations for future agendas?
Yeah, not that it's, pressing necessarily, but I wouldn't mind us working on the ideas for this downtown transition and what the value of some of that could be. Overlay zoning district, I don't know, something like that, where, because we've never really defined what it's good for, right? And then in that, and this, the reason I say that, that might be handy to be expedited. And I think that the sushi shop brought up a reasonable idea with that, is that as we have this expansion, maybe really take a better look at what is the downtown design district and the standards that might go with, the expansion, but also how much of these properties that are in the downtown design district maybe shouldn't be, but should be under this new, standard that maybe isn't quite so stringent. I don't know if anybody agrees with that, but, again, and only if we're gonna be changing the map and various things, that might be something, I don't know, maybe that's not necessarily on the map when it comes to the comp plan, the downtown design district, but, the downtown design district is, and the review process is important for, the very core that surrounds the square as it's noticed by the public while attending the square. But I think some of the buildings within it, maybe it'd be nice to have standards still, but with fewer rules. So that, it could be a staff-reviewed process or something rather than the whole big, long, drawn-out through everything and stuff. That's an idea from me for future agenda.
So you're saying that's anything within the downtown, you wanna not have so many regulations on it?
No, that's not what I meant to say.
That's how it
That's the way I understood it.
Things within the downtown transition would have, because right now some of them have nothing because they're not part of downtown. As an overlay district, if they choose to start to use some of the advantages that maybe we choose to put in place as that district, but then they would want to conform to some standards that we would set, but they wouldn't necessarily be reviewed standards by, like, the way that the design district is. In other words, they wouldn't have to have traditional storefronts and the various things that are trying to be promoted for a set of buildings that's really only the square. Those, I'm not fighting on those ones. I would, but I'm not.
You probably can't at this level, but
So one way of looking at it is to simply say, you know, the downtown core are those buildings that have zero lot lines. I mean, they're touching each other. And obviously you would have a higher standard for those as opposed to a single building on a single lot and it's not attached to anything else, right? Because you just have a different, you know, context is totally different. So, you know, again, you know, building off what Benny's saying, in that tier 2 area, basically you would still have, you know, site plan, architectural review, but you would have, you know, a lesser standard, but you would still have high enough standards that talks about architectural materials and building elements and four-sided architecture, because it, you know, basically what you're trying to do is, you know, make the downtown core bigger, but just a little bit differently, right?
So we'll think about that for future agendas then. Anybody else have anything else for, future agendas? All right, next meeting, July 12th, 6:30. Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Meeting adjourned. John, you'll be part of us next week, right? Or next, meeting?